Living in the deep woods was supposed to be peaceful. I had always imagined a quiet life away from the city. No traffic, no noise, just me, my wife, and our little home, surrounded by endless trees. For the most part, it was exactly what I had hoped for. But over the years, something changed. The woods stopped feeling safe. It started with footprints. The first time I noticed them, it had just snowed the night before. Thick, fresh powder blanketed the ground, untouched, except for the usual deer tracks near the tree line. As I walked to my truck that morning, I froze. There were footprints in the snow, human footprints. They came from the woods, walked directly up to my truck and then turned around, disappearing back into the trees. No prints leading to the house, no signs of where the person had come from before reaching the truck, just a straight path from the darkness of the forest to my vehicle and back. I called out, half expecting someone to answer, but there was only silence. The footprints were barefoot, the individual toes perfectly outlined in the snow. My stomach churned. It had been below freezing all night. No one in their right mind would walk out here without shoes. I shook it off, told myself it was some drunk local messing around, and went about my day. But that was just the beginning. A few weeks later, it happened again, except this time, the footprints weren't just near my truck. They were all around the house. They circled the building in uneven patterns, sometimes stopping at the windows. Some led directly up to the front door, as if whoever it was had been standing there, just inches from the entrance, watching. That night, I sat in the living room with all the lights off, staring out the window, my shotgun resting on my lap. I don't know what I expected to see, but the thought of someone or something out there in the dark, watching us, made my skin crawl. Nothing happened that night. No sounds, no movement. But when I stepped outside the next morning, my heart dropped. The footprints were back. More this time, and this time, they didn't leave. The last footprints stopped in the middle of the yard. There was no trail leading away. It was as if whoever had been standing there had just disappeared. I told my wife about it, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably just kids from town playing pranks. I wanted to believe that, I really did. But the nearest town was over 20 miles away. No one would trek this deep into the woods just to mess with us. At least no human would. And then, one night, I finally saw them. It was late, past midnight, when I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought I had imagined it, just the wind howling through the trees. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate crunching of footsteps in the snow. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps weren't rushed or erratic. Whoever was out there was moving carefully, purposefully. I nudged my wife awake, whispering, "Someone's outside." She sat up, confused, still half asleep. I grabbed my shotgun from beside the bed and crept toward the window. The porch light cast a dim glow across the yard, illuminating the snow-covered ground, and that's when I saw them. Figures, 3 of them, standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the darkness. They were naked, their skin pale and almost gray under the moonlight. They didn't move, they didn't shiver from the cold. They just stood there, watching. A surge of fear gripped me. I wanted to call out, to demand who they were and why they were on my property. But something deep in my gut told me not to. Something told me they weren't normal. One of them suddenly took a step forward. That was enough for me. I yanked the curtain shut and backed away, my heart pounding. My wife whispered, "What? What did you see?" I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I had no way of explaining what I saw without sounding insane. So I simply said, "There are people outside my house and they won't leave." The dispatcher told me they'd send a patrol unit, but considering how far out we lived, it would take a while. I wasn't going to wait. I turned on every exterior light and stood at the front door, shotgun in hand, waiting. The figures were gone. The moment the lights hit the tree line, they had vanished. No footprints, no sign they had ever been there. When the police finally arrived, they did a full search of the area. Nothing, no tracks, no disturbed snow. It didn't make sense. I knew what I saw. My wife hadn't seen them, but she had heard the footsteps. That was enough to convince her we needed to take this seriously. The officer who took my statement must have noticed how shaken I was, because before he left, he lowered his voice and said, "You're not the first person out here to report something like this." That made my blood run cold. I wanted to ask more, but he simply told me to stay armed, keep my doors locked, and if you see them again, don't engage. The next morning, we packed our bags and left for my brother's house in the city. We stayed there for a few weeks, trying to convince ourselves that what we saw had an explanation. But we both knew the truth. The woods had never been empty, and whatever was out there was still watching. Hiking the Pacific Crest Trail alone had always been on my bucket list. Something about the sheer solitude of walking for weeks, surrounded by nothing but nature, felt almost spiritual. I had spent months preparing, buying the right gear, planning. My resupply stops, and mentally preparing for the isolation. I wasn't worried about wild animals. I wasn't even worried about getting lost. What I never prepared for was someone following me. The first few days were uneventful, beautiful. Even, I hiked through vast forests, crossed icy streams, and camped under a sky littered with stars. The silence was peaceful, and aside from the occasional fellow hiker, I was completely alone. Then, small things started happening. At first, they were easy to dismiss. I'd wake up in the morning and find my gear slightly out of place. My cooking utensils would be on the wrong side of my tent, or my backpack would be unzipped when I was sure I had closed it. I told myself I was just being careless. Maybe I had forgotten where I put things after hiking all day. But then, on the fourth night, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. My food bag was missing. I had tied it up in a tree the night before, standard practice to keep it away from bears, but now it was gone. The rope was still tied to the branch, cleanly cut. No animal had done that. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside my tent made my skin crawl. The crackling of branches, the whisper of the wind, it all felt wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time the sun rose, I had convinced myself it was just another hiker playing a prank. But as I packed up and started walking, the unease never left me, and then I saw the footprints. They were too fresh, a single set, leading off the trail and disappearing into the dense brush. They weren't from boots like mine. They were barefoot. I stood there, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whoever had made them had been watching me. That was when I realized I wasn't alone out here. I walked faster than usual that day, pushing myself through the rough terrain. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Maybe another hiker had lost their boots. Maybe it was some eccentric survivalist living off the grid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I realized I had to find a place to set up camp. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but hiking in the dark was too dangerous. Reluctantly, I picked a spot near a creek, made a small fire, and set up my tent. I tried to eat, but my stomach was knotted with unease. Then, as I sat by the fire, I heard it, a twig snapping. I froze, my pulse pounding. The sound had come from behind me, just beyond the firelight. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the tree line. The forest was dark, the shadows deep, but something was there. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just endless darkness. But I felt it. Someone was watching me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly hunted. I made a decision. I wasn't going to sleep that night. I packed up my things, doused the fire, and started walking. I didn't care how exhausted I was. I wasn't going to be caught alone in my tent. For hours I walked. The trail was barely visible in the moonlight, but I kept moving, forcing myself forward. My legs ached, my body screamed for rest, but I refused to stop. Then just as dawn began to break, I glanced over my shoulder and I saw him. A man, thin, disheveled, standing just off the trail. He wasn't wearing a shirt. His pants were mine. My blood turned to ice. Those were the same pants that had gone missing from my pack 2 nights ago. He just stood there, watching me, his face blank, his body still. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached a ranger station near the end of the trail. I must have looked like a madman, breathing hard, covered in sweat, panic in my eyes. I told them everything, the stolen food, the footprints. The man wearing my clothes. They searched the area, but they never found him. I finished the trail, but the experience haunted me. Even now, years later, I still dream about it. The feeling of being watched, hunted, followed, and sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that somewhere out there in the woods, he's still watching. I've worked as a logger for most of my life. It's dangerous, back-breaking work, but it pays well, especially when you take the jobs no one else wants. That's how I ended up deep in the Olympic National Forest, miles away from civilization, cutting down trees in an area where most companies refuse to work. They never told us why. My partner Dan and I had been out there for a week. It was just the two of us, a chainsaw, and the endless sea of towering pines. The work was exhausting, but the worst part wasn't the labor. It was the silence. Something about these woods felt wrong. No birds, no rustling of animals, just the sound of our saws cutting through the stillness. Then the voices started. At first, it was just a murmur, faint whispers over our radios. I figured it was interference, maybe another crew somewhere nearby. But when I asked Dan if he could hear it, he went pale. I thought that was you. That night, as we sat by the fire, we tried to laugh it off. Just the wind, Dan muttered, though neither of us believed it. Then, sometime after midnight, we woke up to the sound of movement, footsteps, heavy ones, circling our tents. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the flap, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing, but the footsteps kept going. Dan and I barely slept that night, and by morning we had decided we were finishing the job early. But before we could leave, we found something that made my stomach drop. About 50 yards from our camp, hidden between the trees, was an abandoned tent. It was old, covered in leaves and dirt, as if it had been there for years. The flap was partially open, revealing a backpack, a sleeping bag, and a single boot. And the worst part, the inside was covered in long, deep scratch marks. We stood there, frozen, staring at the abandoned tent. The scratch marks on the inside weren't from an animal. They were deliberate, deep, jagged, like someone had been trapped inside, clawing to get out. Dan swallowed hard. "We need to go, now." I nodded. The job didn't matter anymore. Something bad had happened here. We rushed back to camp, packing up as fast as we could. But just as we were about to leave, our radios crackled to life. At first it was just static. Then through the distortion, I heard a voice. "Help, please." Dan and I locked eyes. The voice was weak, desperate, but distorted like it was coming from far away. Then another voice joined in. "Don't leave me." A third. "They're coming." And then the most terrifying part, laughter low, twisted right behind us. We spun around, but the woods were empty. That was it. We ran. We jumped into the truck and tore down the logging road, the trees blurring past us. But as we rounded a bend, Dan let out a choked gasp. There was someone standing in the road. No, not someone. Someone's, at least 6 figures, standing shoulder to shoulder in the middle of the path. They were motionless, pale, too thin, their clothes tattered, their faces blank. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. My heart pounded as the figures just stood there, staring. Then in unison, they took a step forward. Dan screamed. I threw the truck in reverse, slamming the gas, my hands shaking as I tried to get the hell out of there. By the time we reached town, we could barely breathe. We went straight to the sheriff's office, told them everything. They sent a team out to investigate. They found the abandoned tent. They found the scratch marks, but nothing else. No footprints. No bodies, no sign that anyone had ever been there. A week later, we got a call. Another logging crew had gone out to that same forest. One of the men went missing. They never found him. Dan and I never worked another job in the deep woods again. Because whatever is out there, it doesn't want to be found.